He's my son. I love him. It doesn't matter. He's more important than anything that could happen to me.
12 days before his death, Rob Reiner sat under soft lights and said something he had never admitted in public. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about film. It was about his son, Nick, and the haunting truth that he could no longer stay silent. "I can direct a film," he said, "but I cannot direct my child's life." No one watching knew it would be his last interview, or that it would change everything. The moment Rob Reiner finally spoke. On December 2nd, 2025, Rob Reiner sat under the soft lighting of a quiet studio, facing what would become his final interview. The host had asked a routine question about family, simple, non-invasive, but what followed was far from scripted. There was a pause, a long one. Reiner, aged 78, dropped his gaze, folded his hands tightly in his lap, and stayed silent for nearly 20 seconds. The room grew tense. Viewers watching the footage later would note how his shoulders sank, how something deep and unspoken had surfaced all at once. In that moment, Rob's usual confidence, honed over decades behind cameras and red carpets, was nowhere to be seen. His voice when it came was quieter than anyone had expected. "There are things," he said slowly, "that you understand only once you become a father, and things you still can't fix, even after being one your whole life." The words didn't just answer the question, they cracked something open. It was clear, this wasn't about family in the abstract. It was about Nick Reiner, his son, and the battle Rob had carried in silence for over 30 years. The pain behind his eyes wasn't theatrical. It wasn't performative. It was raw and delayed, the kind that only emerges when a man finally admits he's out of time. He didn't mention Nick's name immediately. He didn't have to. The emotional weight in that studio was the result of decades of failed rehab visits, strained dinner tables, late-night calls, and quiet dreading. For Rob Reiner, the storyteller of Stand By Me, 1986, and The Princess Bride, 1987, this wasn't fiction. This was the moment truth stepped out from behind the camera. What viewers didn't know then was that this recording, this quiet, vulnerable hour of reflection, would be his last. 12 days later, Rob Reiner would be found dead in his Brentwood home, alongside his wife, Michelle Singer. And that moment in the studio, when he looked down, clenched his hands, and finally spoke, would become the most replayed and quoted segment of his final days. Not because of what he revealed about Nick, but because of what he revealed about himself. That interview marked the first time Rob Reiner allowed the public to glimpse his private grief. But what haunted audiences even more was the sentence he said next. A phrase that seemed to carry the full weight of every missed opportunity, every sleepless night, and every quiet moment of helplessness. It was a single line that instantly echoed across social media, headlines, and tributes. A line he had never dared to say out loud, until that very moment. The sentence he had never said out loud. "I can direct a film, but I cannot direct my child's life." That was the sentence. And when Rob Reiner said it, the studio fell completely still. The line wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't part of a press campaign. It came from somewhere deeper, a man's acknowledgement that success in one world meant very little in another. It was a truth many parents fear but rarely voice, that no matter how much you love, provide, or guide, your child's path may still diverge into darkness. Even Rob's most devoted fans were stunned. For over 5 decades, he had cultivated an image of warmth, wisdom, and strength, both in front of and behind the camera. He was the director who gave us stories about friendship, morality, and resilience. But now, for the first time, he revealed the one story he had never mastered, the one closest to his heart. The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any dramatic script. They were devastating precisely because they were real. Rob had rarely spoken about Nick in public. And when he did, it was measured, respectful, hopeful, always leaning toward redemption. But in that moment, something shifted. There was no denial, no careful wording, just a father speaking plainly. Viewers later said it was like watching someone confess to gravity. Not guilt, not failure, but the heartbreaking reality that some things are beyond our reach, even for those who've built worlds from scratch, even for a Reiner. Looking back, some believe Rob knew it might be his final chance to speak honestly. Whether he sensed the future or simply grew tired of hiding it, no one can say. But those words, spoken on December 2nd, became a kind of emotional will, a final offering, a truth that echoed louder than any headline. I cannot direct my child's life. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a surrender. And in that surrender, Rob Reiner became more than a filmmaker. He became every parent who's ever feared they were too late. While that sentence would haunt many, it also opened a door, an invitation to understand the story behind it. Not the career, not the legacy, but the son, Nick Reiner, born into a house of brilliance, shadowed by legacy, and burdened by expectations no child ever chooses. To understand Rob's final words, we have to begin much earlier. In 1993, when a boy was born into a family where failure wasn't just feared, it was forbidden. Introducing Nick Reiner. Nick Reiner was born in 1993, the son of two Hollywood figures, Rob Reiner, acclaimed director, and Michelle Singer Reiner, producer and activist. His grandfather was Carl Reiner, a comedy legend. From the outside, his childhood looked like privilege, elite schools, access to creativity, famous family dinners, but inside, it was something else. Because Nick wasn't just born into comfort, he was born into comparison. Every achievement came with a silent question. Is this enough for a Reiner? In many ways, Nick's environment was pre-scripted. Creativity was the family currency. But where his siblings, like Jake and Romy Reiner, thrived in acting or production, Nick faltered. Not because he lacked talent, but because he was never allowed to just be ordinary. From a young age, he was viewed through the lens of his last name. Not Nick, but Rob Reiner's son. And before long, that lens became a burden heavier than any trophy shelf. Rob himself would later admit that he wasn't always present. Film sets, travel, projects. He was loved, Rob once said, but not close enough to anchor. That distance may have seemed small in the moment. A missed dinner here, a delayed conversation there. But over time, it grew. Nick wasn't neglected, but he wasn't grounded either. And in a house of legacy, being unmoored can feel like being invisible. The irony is cruel. In a family that built stories of human connection, Nick struggled to find his own. Fame didn't nurture him, it pressured him. And by the time he reached his teens, the gap between father and son was no longer just emotional, it was existential. Nick Reiner was a boy, growing up under shadows that never moved, and expectations that were never his to begin with. Nick's childhood was never simple, but his teenage years marked the beginning of something far more dangerous. It didn't start with chaos. It started quietly, with shifts too subtle to alarm a busy father. But those changes, once invisible, soon began to rewrite the trajectory of an entire family. And in the years that followed, Rob Reiner would learn a painful truth. The most destructive storms don't arrive with thunder. They arrive with silence. A family where everyone found a path. The Reiner family tree is a mosaic of success. Jake Reiner, Nick's older brother, built a solid reputation in journalism and later pivoted into screenwriting and production. Romy Reiner, born in 1997, pursued acting and visual storytelling through independent films. Even Tracy Reiner, Rob's adopted daughter from his marriage to Penny Marshall, enjoyed a steady presence in Hollywood. In that family ecosystem, everyone had found a lane. Everyone, it seemed, except Nick. Nick's path wasn't defined by failure, but by hesitation. He wasn't aimless, he was overwhelmed. His creative mind often clashed with his emotional weight. There were attempts to write, to collaborate, to find a direction, including a brief involvement with his father on the semi-autobiographical film Being Charlie, 2015. But each step forward was followed by a collapse inward. And in a family where achievement was the default, that collapse became more than personal. It became public. What hurt most wasn't the lack of opportunity. There were plenty. It was Nick's internal collapse, the invisible battles that legacy couldn't fix. Where others found identity through the Reiner name, Nick found only pressure. And with every award his siblings won, every project his father completed, the gap between who Nick was and who he was supposed to be widened. At family events, the difference became palpable. While Jake, Romy, and Tracy shared industry updates, Nick often stayed silent. He wasn't detached by choice, he was retreating. a quiet self-erasure that no one fully recognized at the time. Rob Reiner later confessed he thought Nick was just figuring things out, but the truth was deeper. Nick wasn't lost in career decisions. He was drowning in comparisons, and no one saw how deep the water had gotten. Even surrounded by success, Nick was quietly unraveling. But this unraveling didn't look like chaos. It looked like late arrivals, shorter conversations, and a growing silence that filled the spaces where closeness used to be. And as Nick slipped into that silence, Rob Reiner, the man who had directed stories of redemption and resilience, began to miss the one story unfolding in his own home. It would take years before he understood the early warning signs for what they truly were. The early warning signs Rob Reiner missed. Looking back, the changes began around age 15, when Nick started coming home later, his conversations shorter, and his eyes avoiding contact. It wasn't defiance, it was quiet erosion. Rob Reiner later described it as a slow disappearance. There were no explosive arguments or outbursts, just the gradual fading of connection. And for a father immersed in projects and film sets, it was easy to chalk up to adolescence. Around 2008, the first signs of substance use emerged. A few incidents of drinking, brushed off as experimentation. But that experimentation would soon reveal itself as a pattern. Nick was using alcohol not for thrill, but for numbness. It silenced the relentless voice in his head asking, "What have you done with your name?" For Rob, who had long believed in logic and structure, these early moments felt manageable, a phase to guide his son through. He didn't yet know how deep the struggle ran. It's easy to miss pain when it wears the mask of quiet, but for Nick, silence wasn't stability. It was surrender. And in that silence, something darker began to grow. What started as emotional drift soon spiraled into full-blown addiction. Not the Hollywood kind seen in tabloids, but a deeper, more haunting dependency. One that had nothing to do with rebellion and everything to do with relief. Addiction as escape from the Reiner name. For Nick Reiner, addiction wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of escape. The drugs, bol, and later more serious substances offered something he had never felt growing up under the Reiner dynasty: anonymity. Under their influence, the pressure vanished. He wasn't Rob's son. He wasn't Carl's grandson. He wasn't being measured. For a few hours, he was free. By age 17, Nick's addiction had expanded beyond alcohol. Prescription pills became part of the routine. He was eventually diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a complex condition involving mood disorders and psychosis. This diagnosis explained much of his erratic behavior, but it came too late, after years of masking and coping through substances. The medications helped, but consistency didn't last. Each time things improved, relapse waited just behind the door. As Nick's addiction deepened, Rob Reiner began to learn the cruelest lesson of all: that love, patience, and even clarity can fail against the pull of despair. And as rehab after rehab began to blur together, Rob wasn't just losing his son to addiction, he was losing his hope, piece by piece, visit by visit. Until finally, that hope began to fade, not all at once, but the only way it ever truly does, slowly. 17 rehabs and the slow death of hope. By the time Nick Reiner entered his first rehabilitation program, he was already 18 years old. Rob Reiner still believed this would be the turning point. The moment structure would restore balance, but that belief would be tested repeatedly. Over the next 15 years, Nick would enter 17 separate rehab facilities across California, Arizona, and Nevada. Each stay followed the same cycle: cautious optimism, short improvement, and eventual relapse. Hope did not vanish suddenly. It eroded. Rob waited outside treatment centers every time. No assistance, no publicity, just a father standing in parking lots at 6 a.m., sometimes after driving 200 miles overnight, hoping to see something different in his son's eyes. Sometimes he did. Nick would hug him, promise change, speak clearly for a few weeks. Those moments kept Rob going, but each failure chipped away at something deeper, not love, but belief. Out of that helplessness came an act of quiet desperation. If Rob could no longer reach his son through conversation, maybe he could reach him through the one language he knew best. Not as a director chasing acclaim, but as a father trying to understand pain he could no longer contain. That attempt would take shape on screen, in a film that blurred the line between art and confession, turning pain into art. In 2015, Rob Reiner directed Being Charlie, a film about a young man spiraling through addiction despite family support. On the surface, it looked like another character study. But those closest to Rob understood the truth. This was not entertainment. It was translation. The film mirrored Nick's struggles almost precisely, from the rehab cycles to the emotional distance to the crushing weight of expectation. Nick was involved in the project. He understood what the film represented. During production, father and son spent long days near each other, not arguing, not fixing, just existing in the same space. For a brief period, something softened. Nick later said that watching his father work helped him understand how Rob expressed love, not through lectures, but through effort and presence. As Nick continued to struggle, Rob's world began shrinking in other ways too. The pillars that once held him steady, family, career, guidance, started disappearing one by one. Loss accumulated quietly, not with explosions, but with absences. And those absences would reshape the final years of his life in ways few ever saw. Losses that broke the man behind the camera. In 2020, Rob Reiner lost his father, Carl Reiner, at the age of 98. To the world, Carl was a legend. To Rob, he was something else entirely, his compass. The one voice that could challenge him without judgment. The one person who understood him without explanation. When Carl died, Rob didn't just lose a parent, he lost orientation. Around the same time, Rob felt his career slowing. Meetings grew shorter. Projects stalled quietly. Scripts weren't rejected, they were ignored. He noticed the change not in words, but in tone. You made when Harry met Sally, people would say, in the past tense. By 2022, Rob understood something painful. Hollywood was moving on without him. When Rob Reiner spoke in that final interview, he wasn't summing up a career. He was closing a life chapter shaped by effort without resolution. And in those final words, spoken without drama, he left behind something truer than any film. A final truth that reframed everything that came before it. The final truth he left behind. Rob Reiner entered old age with unfinished stories. Not because he failed to write endings, but because life denied him authorship. His films promised hope. His real life demanded endurance. When he died in December 2025, people remembered his work. But those closest to him remembered something else. A man who never stopped trying. His final words are not remembered as cinematic. They're remembered as human. Not a director speaking to an audience, but a father speaking into the dark. I cannot direct my child's life. That sentence reframed everything. It turned success into humility, legacy into limitation, love into something fragile. Rob Reiner's final words weren't a script. They were a confession, raw, quiet, and filled with pain. In telling his story, he gave voice to every parent who has ever loved someone they couldn't save. And in the end, that truth is what made his legacy more human than ever.